Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Ulrich, and I'm the director of NYU Washington, D.C. It is my pleasure to welcome you tonight to the Abramson Family Auditorium for tonight's event, The History of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. The NYU Studyway program encourages student mobility among the university's 3 degree-granting campuses, New York, of course, but also Abu Dhabi and Shanghai. We have 11 academic centers. The courses are designed to introduce students to unique aspects of each site. It is critical that students studying away at NYU's Washington, D.C. Center be exposed to activities, resources, and people that are unique to our city, such as serving as the center of the U.S. federal government. Tonight's event has been organized as part of one of our courses, The History of American Environmental Policy, and we're glad to have the students here with us tonight. We welcome 3 recently retired executives from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. With nearly 100 years of combined experience at the EPA, these individuals helped to establish the country's primary institution for environmental protection. Leading tonight's discussion is NYU DC lecturer Charles Herrick. Charles is vice president at ABT Associates and is an expert on climate change, sustainability, research, policy analysis, program design, and evaluation. Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Chuck Herrick, who will introduce our expert panel for this evening.
Thanks, everybody, and thanks for coming tonight. We're a quarrelsome group, and we're going to quarrel with the title of this talk tonight. It's not the history, it's a history. We admit that maybe between the 3 of us that we won't encompass the entire history of EPA, but we'll certainly give you an interesting take on it. As Michael said, this event was put together as part of a course here, History of American Environmental Policy. The course is co-listed by Policy, Environmental Studies, and History. So it's a course that tries to find a balance between those 3 disciplines. In the class, we cover the history of the development of policies on American soil that address management and authority over natural resources and environmental amenities. So the course literally stretches back to colonial times. So when we first met each other, we were talking about the Revolutionary War and colonial policies that had an impact on the American environment. The class has now moved forward. We're kind of hovered right now over a period that stretches about from 1970 to the present. So we're at a point in time in the course where we're interested in the Environmental Protection Agency, hence the panel we have tonight. To help the class better become acquainted with EPA and some of its interesting nuance, we've brought in 3 former EPA staff, all of them senior executives, and I'll read a little bit of a bio about each of them. Odelia Funk in the middle. Odelia worked at the Environmental Protection Agency for over 34 years as a manager, senior analyst, and advisor, and addressed a wide variety of environmental and information policy issues in several offices of the agency. Before joining EPA, Odelia was an assistant professor of political science, teaching graduate and undergraduate courses in political theory and government. And while with EPA, she continued to teach and lecture at several universities on courses dealing with environmental politics and ethics, women in politics, and privacy issues. She has published in peer-reviewed articles and book chapters and written conference papers on biopolicy, environmental policy, environmental security, health policy, and privacy. Odelia spent a year recently as an executive in residence at American University's Center for Environmental Policy and a year as an analyst and advisor to the director of the Army Environmental Policy Institute. Closest to me, Art Coinis. Over the course of his 37-year career with the federal government, Art earned the respect of executives and technical staff and at least one consultant for his clarity of thought, creativity, and passion for improving program decision-making and results. As a young policy analyst at EPA, he mastered the mastered the science and policy issues surrounding the use of human health risk assessment in environmental management decisions. His work contributed directly to the adoption of risk management as a program targeting tool, among regional, state, and local planners with whom he worked. As a senior planner, Art led EPA's first efforts to develop environmental goals and performance measures under the GEPRA, or Government Performance and Results Act. Art authored EPA's information access strategy based on the findings of a national dialogue on access to environmental information, which was an unprecedented 6-month outreach effort that brought in the views of over 1,000 EPA stakeholders. Art led the national dialogue, which was by far the largest ever effort undertaken at EPA to understand the needs of its public information audiences. He also led EPA's Big Decisions initiative, which was a look by EPA's top career officials at likely adverse effects of incomplete information on the quality of major regulatory decisions confronting EPA. Art piloted a variety of regional and state and local risk planning studies to help government officials set their environmental priorities. He employed a similar approach while on special assignment to the U.S. Agency for International Development and the World Bank to advise local officials on environmental priorities for the Czech and Polish border regions of Silesia. Is that correct? Silesia? Silesia. Art trained dozens of Eastern European environmental managers and scientists in the use of risk assessment as a policy, planning, and program decision-making tool. And finally, Dan Fiorino, on the far side of the room. Dan is currently director of the Center for Environmental Policy at American University and a distinguished executive in residence in the School of Public Affairs at AU. As a faculty member in the Department of Public Administration and Policy, he teaches courses on environmental policy, energy and climate change, environmental sustainability, and public management. Dan is the author or co-author of 7 books and some 50 articles and book chapters, and his most recent books are, the title of the most recent one is A Good Life on a Finite Earth, The Political Economy of Green Growth, to be published by Oxford in 2018, it looks like. And Conceptual Innovation in Environmental Policy, a book published in 2017, this year by MIT Press. Among his positions at EPA, Dan was Associate Director of the Office of Policy Analysis, Director of the Waste and Chemicals Policy Division, Senior Advisor to the Assistant Administrator for Policy, and the Director of the National Environmental Performance Track. Each of the panelists tonight has been asked to reflect on one question. The questions are written over here on the easel. I know you can't, most of you see them, but the primary question is, in what ways has the agency changed over its nearly 50 years of operation? In giving the panel that question to mull over, I suggested various ways in which they might consider change of the agency. And so we asked them to consider, or we gave them as options to consider how the agency might have changed in terms of policy tools and regulatory approaches that were preferred or used. Changes in the types of environmental issues that were addressed over time. Changes in the agency's relationship with stakeholders, changes in the relationship with industry, with states, with the executive branch, with Congress. Changes in agencies' operation and organization. They may not want to talk about all the organizational reorgs they've been through. And then changes in agency staff or outlook. And then one that I hope is interesting to everybody, changes in the field and disciplines of environmental policy over the last 50 years or so. Before I turn the agenda over to them, a couple of ground rules. We'll go through a sequence. Each of the 3 panelists will give their answer to the question. Other panelists will probably chime in and amplify or question. At the end of the panels, we will have questions that I will read from the class. This is an event is in support of the class, so we'll first take the class's questions, and then we'll, after that, move to questions from audience in the room and virtual audience. So once again, welcome, and we'll turn things over to the panel.
Hello. I actually went down through a series of questions and am trying to be somewhat chronological about it. And this is purely my perspective on these things. It'll be interesting to see if Dan and Art were in the same reality as I was. I missed the 70s. I came to the agency in 1980, but before Ronald Reagan was elected. So there were a lot of rules put out in that first decade. And from talking to some of the people who'd been there and were leading some of the action, there were some pretty broad and large rules that were put into place. And compared to what I saw later, they didn't have nearly the elaborate and extensive analysis behind them that the agency later undertook. So when I walked in the door, there was an elaborate system for conducting internal rule review, trying to make sure that one office didn't undertake rules that would undermine the approach or the issues under a different statute. And then from there, I was just learning the ropes when Ronald Reagan was elected. And that changed things, both the age of the agency and the coming of a new administration, I think, made some significant changes. And so I've written notes here so I can just run over some of this. I think that in the 1980s, that carried on into the 90s and beyond, were efforts to increase cross-office input and analysis. Certainly, I remember when I first joined, the office that I joined was a regulatory review, oversaw the whole agency and ran review processes. And we were very interested in increasing regional input, so the people closer to the states and the field would look at the proposed rules and have something to say about it. There was a special review that was created in that time for the really high-cost rules that were being proposed, and those were chaired by the deputy administrator and involved high-level officials from each of the offices. The central review and management generally, I think, increased in the 80s. And what began, of course, that was really a big deal was that OMB, which had always had some role in the process, really gained in importance and in power to stop rules in their tracks, to require additional analysis and so forth. So that was a large shock to the agency, I think, and its rulemaking compared to the 70s. We also started using automated systems. You know, information IT was starting to be used, and we were trying to leverage it for rule development purposes. Other issues that came up had to do with a question about the kinds of tools we used. And so there was a lot of discussion that went on actually for a long time on the use of cost-benefit analysis, and if we were to weigh the costs of a rule compared to the benefits, how would we deal with the value of a human life saved? And that was obviously a very serious and politicized issue. And economic analysis became a really central force in the establishing and justification for our standards, and that was both the health standards, but also the standards that were by statute related to best available technology. Sure.
I want to add what was I think a landmark event around the subject of rulemaking processes and expectations for the rationale supporting rulemakings, and that was the issuing of the Executive Order 12291, which at least a couple of you out there are nodding your heads. This was a landmark for the entire federal government because, as Delias said, it established a requirement for EPA and all federal government agencies, but in our case for EPA, to do some form of benefit cost analysis for major rules, as she said, rules that could cost the U.S. economy over $100 million a year. It also empowered OMB to become the sort of the judge and jury for rulemakings and the quality of analysis done in support of those rulemakings. So Executive Order 12291, signed by Ronald Reagan in, I think it was January, very, very shortly after he was inaugurated, completely changed the rulemaking ballgame. On a personal note, I was, at the time Odelia was beginning work at EPA, I was working happily at the Economic Development Administration a few blocks away in the Commerce Department. Ronald Reagan singled out the Economic Development Administration as the federal government agency most inconsistent with his personal economic philosophy. In February of '81, I got a pink slip, which, for those of you who don't know, means that as a young hire, or any hire really, but it was the entire, it was the young people in the agency, you're going to lose your job at some point. So on one hand, the president eliminated my job. The next month, he signed Executive Order 12291, which economists like me came to think of as the Full Employment Act for economists. Suddenly, all federal government agencies had to go out and hire economists to do the work newly required under the executive order. So very shortly after that, I went to work for EPA doing reg impact analysis under Executive Order 12291.
So I want to pick up on that and go. Economic analysis became a key center and justification through cost-benefit analysis, which to my mind remains a debatable topic now, but that's a whole other issue. Another thing that was happening in the 80s was IT was becoming more powerful, and the use particularly of geospatial information, which started influencing decisions, but also the ability of both companies and EPA and the public to start looking at things in geospatial terms. External impacts was the OMB review, which again you've heard something about now. There were additional statutory requirements that occurred in these days that we had to do. Impacts for regs, for big regs at least, on its impact on small business and its impact later on environmental takings. Was the government somehow constraining private property rights with its environmental rules? So it became increasingly burdensome in terms of time and money to develop rules. At the same time, we are improving and experimenting with tools for industry input to rule development. In fact, in our organization, regulatory negotiation was experimented with, bringing people in, which gave us, I think, sort of lifelong experiences. It became expensive and cumbersome, but we learned to look at the other side, or try to, and we hoped the reverse was happening with industry. Pollution trading, setting caps has become a cornerstone of some of our air programs. And then later on, particularly in the 90s, there was a big focus on voluntary programs, getting industry to voluntarily provide more information on the one hand, but also to undertake limitations. There were cost of pollution studies that were done that helped justify the agency's work. The negotiation also affected rules, for example, like test rules, which had been contentious, and the agency had put out very few test rules for chemicals under a seemingly powerful statute, TSCA, because there were so many ways to gum up the works with complaints, and so that office started negotiating with industry on testing requirements and got a bit more done. Public input not only through hearings, but in general, the right to know became a big issue in the 80s that carried forward through the 90s. And the idea was that you'd shame companies into doing some things, that if CEOs really knew the cost of their pollution, that they would find more efficient ways to do things and therefore reduce pollution. We had the beginnings of an environmental justice program. We had court cases that were bringing down hammer deadlines, particularly under the RCRA, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which covered both domestic municipal waste, but also hazardous waste. And all this was developing further tools on the one hand, but also complexities. And one of the things that hasn't been a big pusher, but I think was interesting and still continues, is our economists, some of them started looking into investment issues. So should the stock market, people investing in certain stocks, be concerned with the liabilities that might be associated with the hazardous elements of that business? And how about insurance issues? And let me say parenthetically, I believe it was this year for the first time investors in Exxon got onto the floor with a recommendation that I believe passed that Exxon should have to do a study of its environmental impacts and risks. After the year 2000, OMB was focusing increasingly on cross-agency standards. EPA created an Environmental Information Office. The CIOs were established and became increasingly important. And certainly IT systems were getting more complicated, but we started seeing the power of being able to cross-reference information across programs and across media. And when I left there in 2015, the agency was still struggling with that, but it has great promise. It's very expensive, very complicated to change systems. By 2014, there were, in fact, the first time OMB was making agency publish its information about how much it was spending on IT information systems and provide that to the public. Some cross-agency rule reviews were happening so that OMB was making sure other agencies that might be impacted. That had happened before. It was happening more systematically. And certainly the internet became very important. It allowed the public and whoever was interested to compare across an EPA, across the regions and programs, and see if what we were saying about certain chemicals was consistent, if people's understanding of some of the issues and risks were consistent, and partially as a result of that, but partially as a new tool for control, in my view, the public affairs people in 2000, under the Bush administration, started having more and more power for reviewing information products before they were made public. So types of environmental issues. And here there were, I think, a couple of things. So that was sort of the tools and the processes that happened over a period as I saw it. And the types of environmental issues changed as well. In those early days, everybody likes to think back to when the rivers were on fire. There were some big and obvious belching towers and so on. And so those regulations, by comparison, were thought to be easier than the ones where the science was a little less certain maybe, it was more nuanced issues, and there was a lot of pressure to prove the risk, which is, of course, always difficult in a complex system. It seemed to me that as I watched the regulations come through, that the agency was really looking at public health far more than environmental protection. So in the 80s, there were huge issues were statutorily defined. So we had a large and undoable amount of work just from the statutory requirements. There were other complications because pollution travels, as we all know, across boundaries, and pollution transport became an issue among between statutes, but also across state lines. We were pressing the states to take on more responsibility for their delegated programs. In the first Bush administration, that is George Herbert Walker Bush, international issues seemed to gain more importance. And in the 80s, we also had the horrible chemical crisis of Bhopal, India. And as a result, a new and large program, really a right-to-know program, called the Toxics Release Inventory began. And again, as I watched the rules come through, I was astounded that, at least to me, other than the technology standards, the public health standards seem to focus on cancer. So rather than neurotoxins, rather than endocrine disruptors or other serious toxic threats, the agency did a lot of cancer studies and gained some foothold. I think it's because through doing them in cross-agency as well as internal studies and work, the scientists gained more confidence in some of the cancer metrics that they were using. Those were tried in court, not only EPA rules, but rules from the Food and Drug Administration and other agencies. And so some benchmarks were established. And internally, our scientists established a database called IRIS, which was basically the best known science on a series of chemicals to which they would refer and which could be seen by the public or those who disagreed with the agency's findings. The risk emphasis, as I mentioned earlier, became greater and greater. And I know Art has mentioned and cares about the unfinished business study that was done in the late 80s. The value of life saved that I mentioned earlier, and questions like how clean is clean were really strong and difficult issues that the agency grappled with. We were moving from some of the gross problems that the 70s tried to handle into more refined and difficult and complex problems where proving the effects was really, really difficult. In the 90s, I thought some of the targets changed in that we tried, at least the agency tried in a variety of ways, to look at classes of pollutants. I thought a big and important move was a study on indoor air, which became quite contentious, and there were political powers that tried to keep it from being published, but eventually that indoor air study was published, and it focused largely on smoking. But from there was a whole program that developed on indoor air issues. With endocrine disruptors, that office, the Toxics Office, tried for years to come up with a generic approach because rulemaking with individual chemicals or individual pollutants was so cumbersome and so time-consuming and expensive. The air toxins were treated more as a class in the revised Clean Air Act of 1990. The whole new chemicals program in EPA developed a way of sort of a part art and part science called structure-activity relations, where the chemists and biologists would look at chemical structures and try and figure out what the most potent were and how they could guess what would happen with a new chemical based on its proposed structure. We did a lot of negotiations internationally with OECD to try and share information and coordinate programs. And again, I mentioned before, but the voluntary programs helped define issues. We were looking for things where we might agree with industry or might get them to take voluntary steps, and how we could leverage information to make change rather than writing rules on everything. Cancer, we still argue about what constitutes proof, and is there some level below which cancerous substances are not a cancer risk. And another area of class of pollutants, in a way, are ecosystems. We started looking beyond statutory or chemical level of pollutants and looked at the Chesapeake Bay and the Great Lakes and watersheds. We're doing as much as we could to gather information and make judgments about how to safeguard those treasures. Interestingly, at least to me, since I'd been heavily involved in the Right to Know program in the 90s, with a new administration that took office in 2001, the use of the term right to know was sort of banished. It didn't appear anywhere. You didn't use that term. You wouldn't get any ground to take activity if you want to do something in the name of right to know. We started talking about things like clean skies and clean forests. which became pretty contentious in terms of whether it really was cleaning them or not. There was an increased control, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of tools and processes, but as a policy matter, there was increased control through public affairs, which in essence meant the political leadership could control the message better. And this was partially the result of simply better IT standards and the use of the internet. So, for example, I was very heavily involved in promoting an attempt to take all of the Mercury information on our website across the agency, across programs, and try and make sure it was compatible, that differences were made clear, that it was clear to the public and didn't look like there were conflicts. It was a very interesting and very complicated process because offices sort of had a vested interest in their Mercury information. But on the other side, I saw where scientific views that were pretty well established were obscured or silenced. So it gave a different kind of politicization that was possible of the website, which, because of EPA's sort of boisterous and many-headed organization, hadn't been possible before. Regions had to come into line more with, national messages to make sure it all linked together properly. And am I running out of time,
A
probably?
little bit.
Let me just mention.
We have a tyranny of the clock.
Okay, let me mention relationships quickly. With industry, the state, Congress, and with the White House. One of the things that struck me in 1980 when I came was the adversarial relation with industry. And there were people who were kind of cowboys. And I can remember one guy in enforcement who came in and threw down pictures of belching stacks where there was a concern, I think, about arsenic it was, right across the street pretty much from a grade school. And he was outraged, this EPA official, with these industry people in the room. That kind of stuff didn't really go over in the later years as we became a little bit more mature, but also found we're, I think, truly searching ways to cooperate. A lot of advisory committees were established, voluntary programs, as I mentioned, though they're still controversial because in a voluntary program, finding solid standards, if you leave it flexible enough that people can trade off what they're doing for maybe better results, one of the problems the lawyers are always concerned about is whether you can hold people accountable well enough. I will note that I'm away from there now, but the headlines tell me that in this year, whereas we had all these advisory programs and still do, that we used to think of environmental groups and academics in particular as being, we hoped, neutral parties. Now it looks like they are treated as potentially biased if they get grants from the government on a topic, that is, if they're studying it deeply. And industry scientists are brought in on the board. So that would be a big change, I think, from what I saw from my whole tenure there. The states, there have been and continue to be tensions about who's in charge and how tightly EPA is going to kind of control their priorities. And I think that's a natural situation given the writing of the federal rules and really the delegated programs where the states are supposed to comply with EPA's emphases and priorities. One thing I'll notice that over the years, as I've looked at things, it looks to me as if we have most contention in states where there are extraction of national resource industries that are very important to the state, but invariably lead to negative environmental consequences. And so EPA continues, I think, to battle this tension of being effective and being enforceable and giving the state some rooms to innovate, but yet sort of having a national direction which they can define. And I would only say about Congress and the White House that it really depends on, I think, who's in the White House and who's in Congress, how well the relations goes. And that's gone up and down, depending upon, I think, the personalities to some extent, but also the degree to which EPA, which is a highly politicized agency by its very nature, the degree to which it raises a lot of political concerns, then political actors are necessarily going to be reactive and very interested in what EPA is doing. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. That's wonderful. It courses some lifeblood through the dryness of our text. So it makes things more human and more interesting. Art, can you build on Odelia's foundation?
Yes, and thank you, Odelia. As I was listening to you, it occurred to me that we really do see the history of EPA from the perspective that we had in the job or jobs that we held. I know exactly what Odelia did. I, for years, worked around the corner from her and around the corner from Dan a good part of the time. So it doesn't surprise me at all to see and hear what you chose to emphasize. And I'll tell you right from the get-go here that I'm about to do exactly the same thing. I teach a couple of courses. One is in environmental risk assessment and management that draws on nearly 10 years of experience I had as a regulatory impact analyst and as a planner and as an advocate of the use of risk science in all types of EPA decision making. I teach another class in what I call managing and measuring for environmental results, which draws on nearly a decade of experience I had helping the agency to develop its planning and management systems in the late 1980s and early 90s. So I'm sure that you'll hear both those themes come through in the comments I'm about to make. What I'd like to do, now that Odelia has established a timeline of sorts, a chronology, is take us all the way back to the beginning. And unless I'm mistaken, I don't think any of us were there for the creation. But I want to talk about it just for a second because when we arrived, I think in about 1980, the creation story was a subject of legend. I mean, there was talk around the agency about how EPA had been established and what the consequences were that we were living with at that time. So, as I'm sure all of you have discussed in your policy classes, EPA was established by President Nixon under pressure from a Democratic Congress and a groundswell of public opinion. But what you may not have focused on is the fact that he did so essentially by executive order. So the agency wasn't established after the kind of deliberation and discussion that goes on within Congress, and it wasn't invested with the kind of overarching authority that gave the administrator very clear responsibilities and authority over the work going on within EPA's programs. So the immediate effect was that President Nixon established what people, even when I arrived, were calling a holding company. It was a collection of programs that operated fairly independently in ways that I think Odelia alluded to. And on top of that, as I'm sure you've learned in your policy class, the agency got new legislation in rapid succession. So you had the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, FIFRA, please don't ask me to play that out, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and TSCA, all in the course of 7 or 8 years. That just intensified the stovepipe mentality that the agency began with at its creation. So even during those early years, the concept of agency-wide integration, many different forms, but agency-wide integration of administration, of analysis, of work process, for that matter, was the Holy Grail. And a good part of the agency's history for really the first 20, 25 years was to accomplish those different forms of integration that turned EPA from a bunch of individual programs that were empowered by, I believe there were 12 major environmental statutes, into a single agency with an overarching concept of itself. So I mean, that, although it didn't prevent EPA from conducting its business, it prevented EPA from conducting its business in a coordinated fashion. And that was something that became very evident during the early mid-1980s. I'll talk about that in just a minute. So at the same time, I'm just sort of progressing here chronologically. So at the same time that EPA was acquiring its statutory authorities, and public opinion was strongly supporting, any and all efforts to improve environmental protection, there was another another sort of theme running through the U.S. and the U.S. economy, and that was, first of all, the oil embargo, high prices for gasoline, inflation, stagflation, an overriding concern about the economy overall and pocketbook issues in particular. And so while public opinion polls strongly supported EPA, the almost unspoken sentiment was that pocketbook issues and security issues trump environmental issues. So EPA was conducting its business, but at a disadvantage. And in 1977, Russell Train, in what has been called by some an attempt to broaden and strengthen EPA's policy position, announced that EPA is a public health agency. Yes, we're very concerned about the environment. We're very concerned about water quality. We're very concerned about protecting environmental resources, but we are first and foremost concerned about protecting public health. And that started a line of discussion that carried forward into the 1980s. So let me talk a little bit here about a transition that occurred early in the 1980s. Again, I'm sure all of you are very familiar with it, but Ronald Reagan appointed a number of very conservative leaders to run the Environmental Protection Agency early in the 1980s. Their goal was variously described. Odelia has one of their goals on a T-shirt that she's wearing under her sweater this evening. We're going to do more with less, which was euphemism at best. But what it meant was there was a desire to shrink the Environmental Protection Agency down so that it cost the American economy less. And we know how that ended. We know that with Gorsuch, Burford's departure, Bill Ruckelshaus came back to the agency to restore credibility, calm, and so forth. and then after Ruckelshaus came Lee Thomas. And there was an earnest attempt on all their part to try and put the agency back on an even keel. And what that meant was to forge ahead with EPA's environmental mission, but to do it in a principled manner, to do it with the best possible understanding of the supporting science for decision making, and as importantly, an acknowledgement of what science wasn't able to tell EPA decision makers about the nature and magnitude of environmental problems and the best way to go about managing them. And it was this discussion of science that led into a discussion of risk science, and Bill Ruckelshaus first, followed by Lee Thomas, took an active interest in promoting the idea of environmental risk in decision making. The idea being that there ought to be some way of assessing and deriving some sort of probabilistic understanding of the likelihood that exposure to an environmental pollutant would lead to some sort of negative health effect. And as Odelia mentioned in her remarks, the science was, at least in the early years, spotty. And yet it was promising, and it was being used by at least a couple of EPA's programs, especially with regard to decision making on environmental toxics, air toxics, drinking water toxics, and so forth. And in fact, as early as 1982-83, the air programs, NESHAPs, National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants, and EPA's Safe Drinking Water Program were making risk-based decisions. So they were trying to balance even the crude understanding they had about environmental risks that drinking water and air exposures caused against the well-known or easy-to-derive costs of mitigating or preventing those risks. So the discussion moved forward, and in those two offices mainly, in 1983 or so, an issue arose in the Superfund program, which, for reasons that I described earlier, was off in its own corner of the agency trying to figure out how to clean up abandoned waste sites. And the difficulty they were facing was, how clean do we have to make these sites? Back in those days, the monitoring science had improved to the point where you could detect pollutants, heavy metals, and others at the parts per billion level, and without any way of gauging the risks that parts per billion exposures might lead to, the local sentiment was to just keep digging till it's all gone, take all that dirt to an incinerator, and then spend uncounted dollars to burn it. And that just wasn't a workable solution. And for that reason, among others, the Superfund program was languishing, wasn't moving ahead nearly as quickly as the public wanted, nor as quickly as Lee Thomas, who came into the agency as head of the agency's Superfund program, wanted. So, yes, please, go ahead.
This really just to further emphasize your point, Art. I can remember in the World Review role, a 28 or 32, I think it was a 28-page rule, the entire purpose of which was to define empty container. And that was the kind of dilemma that the agency found itself in in the sort of how clean is clean, just, where do you stop? And they decided 28 pages, they could cover that issue.
I wish I would have had that contract.
So how clean is clean? First, highlighted the value of, for many, not everyone, I'll admit, the value of using risk assessment in trying to judge the threat posed by potential exposures in the Superfund program. I think as importantly, though, what it did was draw the Superfund and hazardous waste programs into a larger agency discussion for really the first time. What I think is notable here is that, the program, the programs that have been operating in silos suddenly had to come together and had to begin reconciling their decision-making processes. And in the course of doing so, some interesting observations came out. And one of those observations was that while a toxic in the air poses the same risk as that same toxic in drinking water, and the same potential risk as that toxic at an abandoned dump site, the likelihood of exposures and the actual risks for those three could be very different, and that those differences were important, and should be taken into consideration in a variety of agency decision-making processes. Long story made a little less long is that in 1986, Lee Thomas, who was then the administrator, commissioned a study that would look across all of the different environmental problems being addressed by EPA programs and would develop a ranking that could be used to at least roughly understand the relative risks posed by these problems. And the study was organized to look at what turned out to be 30 different problems, ranging from the abandoned waste site and all the way to global warming. And looked across three different types of effects, three different kinds of risks: risks to human health, risks to ecosystems, and risks to welfare, sort of economic risks, risks that might result from material damage and deterioration resulting from acid rain, that sort of thing. And I think, no great surprise. What did they learn? That air risks and drinking water risks, tend to be much larger than abandoned hazardous waste and even managed hazardous, and especially hazardous waste risks. And I should say that the study was conducted at Lee Thomas's insistence by senior career EPA employees, the people running the programs, highest level people running the programs, but who were career EPA people. So the consensus, if you could reach consensus, would be a lasting one. It wouldn't leave with the political appointees. And the group was successful. The study was known as unfinished business. When completed, Phil Shabikoff, the environmental, well-respected correspondent with the New York Times, wrote a story in which he said something very interesting happened here. A government agency actually stopped to take a reflective look at itself, and it found flaws in how it addresses the problems it has the responsibility for. And third, it has made those flaws public for everyone to see and hopefully to improve. So EPA got lots of good press for unfinished business, but as importantly, here again, unfinished business took all of EPA's individual programs and drew them together into a general picture of environmental protection and the relative importance of different environmental problems and environmental statutes being managed by the agency. And I think all of us looking way back can see how. And one of the other findings of the study was that if you compare EPA's budget allocation to the risk ranking, there wasn't a whole lot of correlation. If you compared EPA's budget allocation to public opinion of the relative importance of problems being addressed by EPA, the correlation was pretty good. So EPA was doing its job from the standpoint of addressing concerns of the American public, but it wasn't doing such a great job of introducing and promoting the science that might be used to make better decisions about allocating funds to EPA programs, and that could be used to educate the public in ways that might bring public opinion more in line with the understanding offered by best science. Should I stop here for a minute?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's, again, you people you all three are touching on things that our book has introduced us to, but you're kind of giving them names and places and making them real, so thank you. Dan, if we could let you riff on Delia and Art and add your own.
Yeah, I'll say a few points and then eager to hear your questions. But I think we talk about change. There's continuity in change. There's a lot of continuity in that the laws that Art and Delia talked about passed in the 70s are still pretty much there. I mean, they've been updated a little bit, one in the Clean Air Act in particular, but the basic model that was established in the 1970s is pretty much what we're working with today. So that's a lot of continuity. You still have, I'm sure there are some changes in congressional committee and subcommittee structure, but probably very similar congressional oversight system, similar relations between federal and state agencies. So there is a whole lot of continuity. There have been some areas of change, though. The ones that stand out to me are one of the problems are very different now. I mean, there still concerned about air pollution and water pollution and chemicals and waste and those kinds of things, but there are a bunch of new problems, of which climate change is the most obvious, but also even within those problems, there are different emphases, so that in the early days of EPA, you're worried about the big sewage treatment plants and the factories and big manufacturing sites and things like that. And a lot of those problems were addressed because you spend enough money and you pass enough regulations and you can sort of get those things under control. So now increasingly we're concerned not about discharges from factories or sewage treatment plants, but we're concerned about non-point source water pollution. So runoff from farms and forest land and air deposition from vehicles and what comes out of stormwater flows and those kinds of things. Radon was not part of the original picture. That became a big issue in the 80s. Stratospheric ozone depletion really was a late 1970s, 1980s issue as the science developed. And of course, climate change. There had been people arguing that there was a problem here with the concentration of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, but the science was coming along, but I think it wasn't until the late 80s that people started, at least to some degree, to pay attention to this whole thing. And now 20 years later, it's really a big, big issue. So I think that that's a big change. I think there are changes in how EPA does business. I think EPA in the 70s was very much sort of a technocratic agency where you develop the standards and you get the smart engineers and you do the economic analysis and you make everybody do that. There's still that core, and to some degree you need that to have basic rules of the game. But I think EPA got a lot more sophisticated at interacting with outside groups and trying to build consensus and establishing policy dialogues, and through the Superfund program working a lot more with communities instead of just telling communities what was going to happen. So I think that was a big change. It's gotten much more international. That's mostly because of climate change, but a lot of other things, regional seas and oceans issues and chemicals that are part of a global market. So I think those are some interesting areas of change. But let me stop so we can hear your questions.
Okay. A question that, this is a question from my class. So as young students in environmental policy, we're intrigued by improvement of policy, improvement of the policy arena. We're inspired by the goal of good governance. I have a question that reads as follows. What is most frequently overlooked in the transition between the study of environmental policy and the implementation of environmental policy in a place like the Environmental Protection Agency? Can any of you reflect on the difference between theorizing about environmental policy and then doing it in the context of the gritty reality of EPA?
Well, it's a lot messier when you actually start to do it, and you see the role of various political forces. And to me, politics is not a dirty word. That's how the alternative politics is, shooting at each other. So you have different perspectives, and you need to reconcile those and come together. So you have laws, and you have economic analysis, and you have scientific analysis, but you're affecting real people and their livelihoods and their health. So it just gets a lot more complicated in the world. And I think in particular, a lot of people who study environmental science, they sort of have this nice orderly universe. And there are uncertainties, but you have methodologies and you have data and you have peer review processes and so on. And then you get out and you see how the science plays in the real world. And although we're at a particularly bad time now where there's deliberate efforts to just delegitimize the whole scientific enterprise, even in normal times, there's a lot of uncertainty and there's a lot of debate, and sometimes the science is a battleground. So I guess just be prepared for a lot more complicated world, a lot more sort of political back and forth, political as well as scientific uncertainty when you're actually doing it.
Two things in that seem, two things, I've got it, but I'm not holding it up. Got two things in that same realm that are anecdotal, but I worked in the toxics office for a number of years, and they regulate the chemical industry. And two little vignettes from that stuck with me heavily. One is I was there for a little while when I realized if you get 4 toxicologists in the room, you could get 5 opinions about the toxicology of a chemical. It was as a non-scientist, I always expected that if there were data and if there were information available, that you'd have probably a consensus about the science. But there's a lot of nuance in the interpretation of science and scientific findings. And so that on top of the political issues and how it plays out in the real world is a fundamental ambiguity that can really be difficult in trying to figure out what's the best theoretical answer even. And that was brought to light in my second example is in talking to part of that office had, I mentioned earlier, structure-activity relationship, a very sophisticated way of approaching looking at the potential toxicity of chemicals by their chemical structure. So they also did chemical nomenclature there. So if something new was coming up, they'd figure out what to call it. And I don't even understand this perhaps well enough to, I'll try and articulate it clearly. But I was talking to one of the people involved in that enterprise, and what I found out is that the chemists particular, in looking at chemical structure, wouldn't necessarily agree on how to talk about this, because depending upon which parts of the structure, if you map it out, you emphasize, you might call it an amine, or you might call it something else. And so the very way you conceptualize what kind of chemical this is ambiguous. And I thought that was remarkable, because I would have expected that at that level it would be, pretty clear and dry if you know the structure. But there's all along the chain of knowledge and information and research, there are judgment calls, there are ways of thinking about things that can affect how you see its risk or how you might characterize it. And that, added to what Dan was talking about, just gave me a deeper sense of the profound difficulty of coming up with precise answers, even from a scientific point of view, much less from a policy perspective.
Well, there isn't too much I can add.
We can move on if you want.
Well, let me just, now that I'm listening to the sound of my voice, I kind of like it. So let me just add one point. To me, the difference between the environmental study and the implementation of an environmental program is sometimes like the difference between the average and the variability that you encounter on the ground in the 10,000 different places where a standard has to be implemented. And so what invariably happens is that a standard is set because it's often the most cost-effective way to provide environmental protection. But the result can often be to overregulate in some places and underregulate in others, simply because the conditions vary from one place to another, and a standard, a national standard, doesn't allow for that kind of variability, and its alternative, which is an implementation approach that allows people the flexibility to take account of the 10,000 different sets of conditions and circumstances where a rule is being implemented, is expensive. And it's expensive for the ground level implementers. So, sometimes the messiness occurs because a rule makes sense on average, or a decision makes sense on average, but often not in some number of situations where it's put to use.
All three of you, I think, have mentioned the importance and significance of perspective on environmental policy. So you've talked about the public perspective, you've spoken about expert perspectives, you've mentioned the perspective of EPA senior staff and how those three things can sometimes merge or diverge, I guess. On the topic of perspective, my class has a question to Odelia, and it's a question about being a woman in the Environmental Protection Agency, being a woman in the field of environmental science and environmental policy, and whether that may have changed for the better or for the worse over time.
I'm very hesitant to speak for any group, even if I'm a member of it. So I would say that, first of all, I came from an academic background where I was often the only woman there. So being in a group that, where gender differences occurred or didn't occur was something I'd been in year two. I think at EPA it had struck me that with my limited experience, direct and indirect, that EPA was more welcoming to women and more open to women playing a wide variety of roles than probably most other arenas, say in the 80s. There were still some struggles, and what I feel I can never really know is people's, particularly their unconscious stereotypes and what they expect of you as compared to how you act. So personally, I'm very attracted by ideas and by problems. And if I'm engaged in an idea or a problem, I can be rather tenacious. I did encounter times, and especially a few personalities, where that I think did not put me in good stead. But how common, I don't know that I could universalize that. So generally I found, although I wasn't always comfortable there, that might have had more to do with my own personality than with being a female. So I'm a bit hesitant, but I think if you look at the demographics, you'll see that women have, from the early years, been treated with respect generally and had opportunities at EPA.
Thank you. Art and Dan, Odelia, you all spoke of the efforts by William Ruckelshaus and Lee Thomas to introduce risk to the agency. And you framed that in terms of something that was somewhat distinct from the stovepipe statute by statute by statute approach to environmental management. So EPA has pursued risk assessment and risk management. In the 90s, I think EPA also pursued an agenda of pollution prevention. EPA has pursued some innovative things. The question is, has EPA ever, do you feel like there's instances or examples in which EPA has pulled Congress along into a more innovative approach to environmental policy? Has EPA set standards that were later taken up in law? Have you pulled Congress along? I thought, okay.
That's like herding cats. I may be in the use of economic incentives and emissions trading. I think maybe some of that stuff in the late 70s. I mean, economists have been calling for applying market-like principles, either attaching fees to pollution or creating artificial markets and letting people buy and sell the right to emissions. And the idea was to make that more stringent than whatever a technology standard would have been. I think a lot of that came from within government and within various interest groups, and then I think it got picked up in Congress and it got codified in the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments.
Okay.
So I think that's one area where it happened. Pollution prevention too maybe came from the broader environmental federal and state people working on different issues, and eventually there was a Pollution Prevention Act in 1990, so perhaps.
To me, it tended to vary across time. I was optimistic in the 80s and 90s, and then sort of lost some of my optimism after 2000. But on the other hand, I think ideas like environmental justice, I keep forgetting this thing, ideas like environmental justice have waxed and waned, and they've never been terribly strong. But on the other hand, the courts have recognized that as a valid principle and a valid issue. So it seems to me that that's progress in a way, to have it be an issue that gets standing in the process somewhere, in the governmental apparatus. But it's been more, I think, in the courts in that case.
As a quick postscript to the unfinished business story, in the year after EPA reported unfinished business results to its appropriations committees, it got an appropriation with language saying, "Great stuff. So from now on, we'd like you to include In your budget proposal, a risk-based priority setting exercise where you explain how you're shifting, your budget request to reflect this, this new understanding we have. And EPA never did it. So to answer your question, the appropriation language would suggest that, yeah, the agency must have convinced a few people, but apparently there weren't enough people within the agency who were convinced to actually take the step Congress was asking for.
I'd like to open it up now for our non-class audience that's been really patient. Questions from the broader audience that the panel can address. We have a microphone coming around.
Yes, thank you all for being here. You mentioned that over time the agency turned from the Environmental Protection Agency to the Environmental and Public Health Protection Agency, and you described how Russell Train started that process. There are a lot of other federal agencies with responsibilities for environment and public health. The Transportation Department regulates vehicles. The Corps of Engineers regulates wetlands. The USDA has responsibilities. Could you describe the history of the relationship between the EPA and other agencies that have either overlapping or corresponding responsibilities for environment and public health?
That's a good question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take a shot at it. This is really a shotgun approach, I fear. So I've seen this from a couple of ways. As an example, there is a very long article in, I forget which law review, 80 pages, I think, I've read it, on vinyl chloride. And it looked in the 80s, and this was part of what focused so much attention on cancer, I think, too, but it looked at how the Labor Department and EPA and maybe it was Consumer Products, it was at least one other agency, how they did and didn't attack the problem, waiting for somebody else to do it or stepping and kind of trying to find their space for what, which is partly a political decision, who has the nerve to take this on, as compared to any clear statutory language. So part of it has been feeling your way along with this. I did a lot of study as a political scientist on biotechnology, and that is tremendously interesting and complicated matter. And as it was emerging, it became a big political issue where OMB took a very firm position that there's nothing new here. It's all the same old stuff because biotechnology entities or products really should be treated like any other chemical. It don't need any new legislation. And so there was a very structured and strong attempt to start drawing the lines between what USDA would do, what FDA would do, what EPA would do, and so on. And you rarely get that kind of effort where you have a centralized, OMB was kind of cracking the whip, where you get this sort of centralized attempt to figure out where the lines are to be drawn. And that was partially by statute, certainly, but also a political decision depending upon how the administration was looking at the problem, and they really wanted to support biotechnology. In the case of lead, there was a lot of coordination between HUD and CDC and EPA, and I was happily in the midst of some of that. And again, I think there was an attempt to share and be mutually supportive, but it is not entirely clear if you just look at the statutes who's got what job. So it really has to be kind of filled out. And I thought that agencies had a tough time, but were getting better at sharing data, at also taking the lessons from court cases if the decision of the other agency was challenged in court. And I think it's a very complicated and tough issue, not only because of the politics, but because the language and what it implies about the agency's authorities and responsibilities is not, self-defined in any individual case.
Let me add a couple of words. I'm thinking of a couple of examples. And in both examples, I'm thinking about there has been a fair amount of tension between EPA and, say, FDA. And the tension, as I recall, centered on EPA's standard methods of estimating human exposure to pollutants. And I think you can see how in the case of FDA, they have a much easier task figuring out who's being exposed. I mean, you buy the product, you use it, you're exposed. Whereas in EPA's case, exposures are often the result, they're a mistake. They're the result of stack emissions, fugitive emissions, dermal exposures. If you happen to go swimming, how many people go swimming? Who knows? How long do they swim? Who knows? And so the other agencies would often question EPA's decision-making around exposure. There was a fair amount of agreement about toxicity, and then when it came to decision-making, that is making balancing decisions between risks and costs, some of these other agencies feel like EPA is willing to settle for less cost-effective decisions, as measured by an estimated cost per life saved in rulemakings. That's clearly the case, I think, in the minds of OMB, that serves as sort of the referee across regulatory agencies in deciding, whose decisions are good public policy and whose aren't.
There's a question.
Hi, thank you. I hope my questions are not outside the topics of this evening. They're two simple questions. I'd like to pull the camera back, and I wonder, since EPA was established in the 1970s, is there another country that has done a better job at establishing an agency that is more effective and maybe more, has been around longer? Is EPA modeled after another country's institution? One question. The second question is the elephant in the room. I'm worried about the dismantling of EPA and its statutory mandate, and how much damage can be done. I mean, can this be recovered in subsequent political environments in the future? How much can be protected from destruction? It seems like an extremely important agency to me.
On the first question, and we could talk more about the second because that's a big one right now. I'm not aware of EPA being based on anything. EPA was one of the first, I think, national environmental regulatory agencies. And through the 70s, practically every developed country, 70s into the early 80s, every developed country established some kind of environmental agency or environmental ministry. And you still hear this. I don't know if you hear it right now, but up until January, you heard that people in other parts of the world would turn to EPA, particularly for the scientific and technical work, for the research capabilities, but also a lot of the legal instruments were used as a model. Bill Riley, who was an EPA administrator under the first President Bush, said that his experience was the further away he went from Washington, the more respect people had for EPA. So I think in other countries, maybe environmental agencies at times have had more consistent support, or they've had more legislative clarity on what they're supposed to do. But I think the U.S. was a pioneer, an environmental pioneer back in those days. Well, if you look at the countries like Norway and Denmark and Sweden, Sweden has a very sort of rational, I mean, they have their issues, but rational arrangement of authority, and there's a pretty good consensus on things like climate change is happening and we need to deal with it. And they have, you know, a whole system of integrated pollution control. They have national environmental objectives. So I think it's hard to separate the agency from the sort of political and economic context that it works in. But a lot of other countries, there's more consensus on what environmental agencies should do and how they should do it.
I would say in connection with that, I can remember, not specifically, but that the International Office at EPA used to have delegations from other countries come. And I specifically remember meeting with delegates from Japan, and they were at EPA to learn about our structure and how we did things, because they were wondering if they could use it as a model. Let me note that at least in doing some studies in the former Soviet Union, one of the things that struck me is that in Russia, for example, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, they had really some very stringent and good-looking rules for things like clean air and clean water. It's just that they didn't implement them. So you have to take into account whether there's really implementation. And I'd like to make just a quick third point, and that is that between Europe and the United States, I think that while we were emphasizing and trying to develop tools for risk assessment and started heavily emphasizing cost-benefit as a way to start making decisions, in Europe they really rely more on prudential judgment, I think. So they don't have as much number crunching when they assess a problem. It's not that they don't study it and look at it, but the rigor of the scientific data is just treated differently there, is my understanding. And they can make, and in Britain I remember reading about how they made some judgments for environmental standards. And it was really more experts getting together and deciding what seemed to make sense based upon what they knew. But without crunching a bunch of numbers to kind of weigh the risks at a level which they thought perhaps wasn't possible given our level of knowledge about exposures and so forth. So it's a different way of thinking about how you get protection given what you can prove, quote unquote, and also the time and money for developing standards.
Your second question.
Little aspect of your first question, though. Another thing to think about might be state agencies that are especially innovative, and some might argue that the state of California is maybe even ahead of the U.S. EPA in terms of scope and innovation. And another country, right? The second question.
Some would argue they already have. Your second question, I'll give you a very personal, it comes up all the time in dinner conversations with friends, you know, what's to become of EPA? Everyone reads the paper, everyone's wondering, you know, will this administration dismantle, 40 years and 50 years of environmental progress? And what I say to them is, I am having lived in the regulatory development world for as long as we have, I think you have an appreciation for, the process moving forward, and a similar appreciation of the process in reverse. It takes a long time to undo, promulgated rulemakings. But that was just what I was going to say. My bigger concern here is for EPA staff, and the effect that poor morale will have on an agency that is, a remark I was planning to make was that when I arrived at EPA in 1981, it was a young agency. The average age was 32, which for a government agency, it's incredible. The attrition rate in a government agency is like 1%. So people don't leave, they stay. And so it was amazing then that the agency was so young. The agency has matured. The agency is now old. And the effect of poor morale could well be that the people, the oldest, and the people who have the greatest knowledge are going to move on. And I think that's the danger. That the agency's effectiveness could be diminished in the long term, even if its rules and regulations aren't weakened.
Yeah, I mean, Art's right. You can't, to undo rules, you have to go through a long, complicated process. But you cannot implement the rules, or you cannot appropriate the money to pay attention to the rules, or you can just leave it to states. That's probably what's going to happen in states. States that want to have clean air and water are going to have it, and states that don't will have a lot more discretion to go where they want to go. But I think you're not only losing the experienced people, but you're also, EPA had limited hiring the last 4 or 5 years because of budget reasons, and now there's probably not going to be any for a while because there's going to be a budget cut, not as much as the president wanted, but there'll be something. And so you're losing that whole generation too. So it's like you're going to have these big gaps in the development of the agency. And then this whole thing about the scientific capabilities. And this is really like 1984, where you deny the science and you just try and ignore it. And you can be an industry scientist and be a good scientist. That's not really the issue for me. The issue is that they're eliminating a lot of these actual scientists, and these are people who are the top people in their field. In fact, they do research for the government is sort of part of their credential, and it should be. Then they're replacing them with marginally capable ideologues, and that's going to be very dangerous. And I think you look at lead, mercury, look at toxics, look at a lot of basic air pollution issues. In the climate arena, there's this absolute denial. Every National Academy of Science in the world and practically every serious scientist says this is a real problem and we're seeing the impacts already, and there's a refusal to deal with it. So that's all very disturbing.
I would add that Dan had mentioned states, letting the states have their ways. I can remember in the 80s, the term came up of race to the bottom. And one of the issues that came up now and again reliably was how much control over any individual state program. As I mentioned, that was a tension that is really baked into the arrangement of EPA rules and state delegated programs. And part of it is inevitable and natural, but the need to have some kind of clear standard to be met by the states, and that their delegated programs to be approved and legitimate have to meet at least certain bottom line standards. That was a way of preventing actually economic competition between states that's carried on at the cost of exposed populations. And this is an issue that has, I think, a lot of tentacles and reverberations if, in fact, and I think a lot of things, because I spent a year looking at fracking. And you look at the number of fracking wells and one question is whether there's sufficient standards, but the other one is whether they're enforced. You can have reasonable looking standards, but if the enforcement mechanism, be that federal or state, just can't handle it or won't handle it, then you can start having word travels quickly of where you can dig the most wells or get the most money. And that's always, I think, at least an issue. Whether you have oil and gas lines that have the latest technology or whether they are bound to be leaking within 20 years. It's a huge issue for groundwater. But those kinds of things that can affect wide populations, and you have transport of pollutants, are ones where I think we need to be concerned if there are states who really, for economic reasons or other, do not uphold sufficiently high standards. And that, I think, to me, that's at risk.
It seems to me that it's so important it should be international standard. Not really leave it up to states as if I could throw all the trash in my backyard because that's my private property. You know, it's kind of like an exaggerated example.
Yeah, and this issue predates the current time too. So one of my favorites was, what do you allow to be built on, on the ocean side of the dunes? And do you allow houses to be built there where it can be disruptive to the oceans, where it affects the currents? Who pays if there's a hurricane? Is that public support to rebuild? It's very complicated sets of issues, and it's in the name of private property. Well, that strong urge towards private property, it's mine, continues. And it's not new right now, but the stakes are pretty high, I think.
We've gone on for quite a while, especially in terms of kind of human capacities. I know there's two more questions, three more questions. Maybe we can just take the 3 questions and then adjourn from there.
Hi. Hi, I was wondering if you could tell us whether you think the courts will play a role in the future with EPA, because they have been siding for environmental health and protection, and whether that will change given the ability of this administration to have a large part in changing the construct of courts into the future.
Well, yeah, the courts are going to be very busy because there's going to be a lot of litigation going on. I have a friend who's a senior position on one of the big national environmental groups, and we talked 2 days after the election last year, and they had just had a senior staff retreat. And I said, well, what did you decide? And he said, well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to hire a lot of lawyers, because they knew that litigation was sort of the last front. I mean, the executive branch and the Congress are not going to be responsible about protecting public health and the environment. But the laws are still there. And so you take it to court. And I think that's going to be a real constraint on what the administration can do, because there are requirements that certain things are supposed to happen, certain standards be set under certain criteria. So yeah, it's going to be a very busy time for courts and environmental lawyers.
And while I believe that and want to believe it, I would just add, I think part of the question had to do something worries me, and that is the ability of this administration to fill many judicial seats. And whereas in the previous administration, 8 years, they could not get their nominees brought to the table for discussion, and so they didn't really get they didn't fill that many seats. And it's looking like they're putting a big push on this, and certainly from what I've read, certain members of Congress are really wanting to help get those judicial roles filled, and that will affect courts and litigation outcomes for decades to come. So I think it's a legitimate worry, but we'll see.
My question kind of tacks on to the end of hers, but with a bit more specifics. So the toxic substance, that was just recently updated, and so they have to have the scoping document and the risk assessment, but the final rule that they wrote is, kind of terrible, but it's legal. That is the rule. That is what they have to follow. And so I imagine we're going to see a lot more of that, and we're going to see these risk assessments on these different chemicals. And if you can decide what use is, just however you want, which is how the rule is written, there's going to be a lot of consequences down the line. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. So what does the EPA look like when you have the industry scientists writing all the rules? And I know you're saying that rules take a long time to undo, but they're writing rules right now. How long will it take to undo those rules?
Well, yeah, well, in the chemicals area, and there are decisions made on specific chemicals, so there's near-term opportunity, but there's going to be a lot of litigation in that area, too. I mean, everybody was so encouraged because there was a new chemicals law, a new version of the Toxic Substance Control Act in 2016, which wasn't perfect, but general agreement that it was a lot better than the previous law, which was 40 years old, but now it has to be implemented. And I don't know if people saw, the New York Times did a very thorough story a couple of weeks ago, right? Yeah, that really looked at a lot of these chemicals issues. That's definitely worth, I think Eric Lipton was the reporter, but that's definitely worth looking at. Yeah, and our mutual friend, Wendy Cleland Hamlet, who was a very mild-mannered, serious person, was like in the middle of the story. But, she sort of kept pushing back, and finally said, I can't do any more, and she retired. And that may be a story that you'll see elsewhere.
One last question in the middle, I think.
Is there any course of action that the EPA can take to make up for Trump's executive orders repealing rules such as the Clean Water Rule?
For existing rules, you can't undo them with an executive order any more than you can keep immigrants from coming to the United States by executive order. There are legitimate policies might be overcome with an executive order, but if you have a statute or a rule that governs, an executive order cannot overturn it. And so what tends to happen is, back to what Dan says, that's litigated. New rules might be similarly litigated. If the rule is in violation of the standards outlined in the law for that regulation, then you could have a group challenge it as not meeting the standards in the statute. So that's another way a new rule, if it is arguably not sufficient or wrong, might be kept in abeyance.
You were referring to the waters of the U.S. rule. That rule and the work that went into it was 10 years in the making. And, an EPA administrator can decide today, a president can decide today, we're not going to use it. That doesn't say that in 2 or 3 years, his successor can't say, there was a lot of public opinion support. You hear about the cons, but there was a lot of public's opinion in support of that rule too. It clarified a variety of decisions that had been in dispute for as long as the Clean Water Act has been implemented. So again, I think if you look at the sweep of history here, it's encouraging. It's encouraging because we could just be seeing temporary holds that are going to be lifted sometime in the not too distant future. I guess I sound very optimistic, and at this point I still am.
You're nicely optimistic. Thank you. And on behalf of the NYU community, thank you for doing this tonight. I know I wanted you all to just react and reflect spontaneously, but I know you all did tons of work to prepare for this, so thank you. But beyond tonight, I just want to recognize and thank you for, first, your service to EPA, and then your contributions to the disciplines and fields of policy sciences and environmental studies. So thank you. Dan, Odelia, Art, thank you.